The storm arrived without warning, the way the worst things always did. One moment, the road was merely gray and cold, the sky the color of old pewter, pressing low against the bare hills. The next, the wind turned savage, and the snow came sideways, and Eleanor Ashworth could no longer see the horses in front of her. She could hear them, their frightened snorting, the coachman's increasingly desperate commands, but the world had contracted to a white wall in every direction, and the carriage was slowing, and then it was stopping, and then the coachman was climbing down with his lantern held uselessly against the dark. Miss Ashworth. His voice was careful in the way that men's voices became careful when they had bad news they had not yet decided how to deliver. The lead horse has thrown a shoe. I cannot take us further tonight. Eleanor sat very still inside the carriage. She had been sitting still for most of the day, because stillness had become her primary skill. Over the past several years, she had learned it in her stepmother's house, how to take up less space, make less sound, require less of everyone around her, so that they might forget she was there and leave her in peace. The skill had served her poorly in the end. Her stepmother had remembered she existed with perfect clarity and had made arrangements accordingly. She had been given 3 days to collect her things. "Is there shelter?" Eleanor asked. The coachman held up his lantern. Through the howling white, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, there was a light, a single warm square of it, steady against the storm. A house. Something large, from the faint suggestion of roofline she could make out. Something with walls and a fire and, God willing, someone inside who might be persuaded to take in a woman with nowhere else to go. She had become, she realized, quite practiced at that particular kind of hoping. The walk was brutal. She arrived at the door of Ashfield Manor. She did not know it was called Ashfield Manor yet. She did not know anything about it except that it had a door, and she was standing in front of it, with her cloak soaked through and her fingers numb, and her hair plastered against her face, in a way that she was quite certain made her look precisely as desperate as she felt. She knocked. She waited. She knocked again. The man who opened the door was not a servant. She knew it immediately, the way one knew such things, by the quality of his stillness, by the way he occupied space, as though the space had been arranged around him rather than the other way around. He was tall, dark-haired, with eyes the color of winter sky, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not read. Not unkind, not particularly welcoming, simply assessing, the way one assessed an unexpected problem that had appeared on one's doorstep in the middle of a blizzard. "I am sorry to disturb you," Eleanor said, because she was always apologizing for her existence, and the habit was deeply ingrained. "My carriage has stopped. The horse. There was a shoe. I need—" She stopped, gathered herself. "I need shelter for the night. One night. I will be gone at first light." The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," said James Cavendish, Duke of Ashfield, and it was the simplest thing he had said to another human being in 3 years. His housekeeper, Mrs. Holt, materialized from somewhere in the depths of the house with the particular efficiency of a woman who had been managing crises long before this one. She took Eleanor's soaked cloak, pressed a cup of something hot into her hands, and installed her in front of the drawing-room fire, with the brisk competence of someone who had decided the situation required action rather than conversation. The Duke stood at the edge of the room and watched all of this happen with his hands clasped behind his back. "The storm will not break tonight," Mrs. Holt said, addressing the Duke with the familiarity of long service. "The roads will be impassable until morning at the earliest." "Yes," said the Duke. He was still looking at Eleanor, though she had the impression he was not entirely aware that he was doing it. "I will have the blue room prepared." Yes. Mrs. Holt disappeared. Eleanor wrapped both hands around her cup and stared into the fire and tried very hard not to think about where she would go when morning came, since she had no clear answer to that question, and thinking about it would not improve matters. She was aware, in the periphery of her attention, that the Duke had not left the room. He was standing by the window now, looking out at the storm, and the silence between them was not precisely comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It was simply the silence of two people who did not know each other, sharing warmth because the alternative was cold. "Where were you going?" he asked. The question was quiet, not demanding. She had the sense he asked it without entirely intending to. "I'm not entirely sure," Eleanor said, which was the most honest answer she had. He turned from the window then, and something in his expression shifted, something she could not name, some small adjustment behind his eyes. "That is an unusual answer. It is an unusual situation." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that assessing quality again, but it had changed slightly. There was something in it now that was almost not curious exactly, something more careful than curiosity. "My stepmother made certain arrangements. I was given 3 days to collect my belongings. I collected them. The storm was not part of anyone's plan." The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You may stay until the roads are clear," and walked out of the room before she could thank him. She stayed 3 days. The roads cleared on the second morning, briefly, but the coachman reported that the horse would need another day at minimum, and the road to the north was still treacherous. And Eleanor, who had nowhere specific to be, found that she could not manufacture sufficient urgency to insist on leaving. Mrs. Holt fed her breakfast and showed her the library without being asked, as though she had assessed Eleanor's character during the night and reached a conclusion. The library was extraordinary. Floor to ceiling, 3 walls of it, a fire already lit, and the smell of old paper and beeswax that Eleanor had always found more comforting than almost anything else in the world. She was sitting in the window seat with a volume of Virgil when the Duke found her, on the 3rd morning. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "The Aeneid," she said, because something had to be said. "In Latin? My father taught me." A small pause. "Before he died." The Duke came into the library then, slowly, as though he was not entirely certain he had decided to do it. He sat in the chair by the fire, not near her, but not as far as he could have chosen, and picked up a book of his own, and they read in silence for 2 hours, and it was the most peaceful 2 hours Eleanor had experienced in longer than she could remember. He did not ask her again when she was leaving. A week passed. The horse recovered. The roads cleared. Eleanor wrote 2 letters, one to a distant cousin in Bath who had once expressed vague willingness to be helpful, one to a former governess who might know of a position somewhere. She did not receive replies. She helped Mrs. Holt reorganize the linen cupboard on the 2nd floor because she had noticed it was in some disorder, and she needed something to do with her hands. and Mrs. Holt accepted the help with the matter-of-fact warmth of a woman who had decided Eleanor was sensible and therefore welcome. She ate dinner alone in her room the first 3 nights, and then Mrs. Holt informed her that His Grace ate in the dining room at 7, and there was no reason for 2 people to eat in separate rooms when the dining room was warm and the food was the same. Eleanor ate dinner with the Duke. He was not, she discovered, what she had initially taken him for. She had assumed the coldness was character, the natural temperature of a man who had been born to power and had never needed warmth. But it was not coldness exactly. It was distance. There was a difference. Coldness was the absence of feeling. Distance was feeling held carefully back, kept behind glass, maintained with the kind of deliberate effort that looked like ease until you looked closely enough to see the effort. She looked closely. She had always been good at looking closely, at reading the small signals in a room, because in her stepmother's house, your survival depended on knowing the weather before it arrived. The Duke, she determined, was not cold. He was careful. "You don't have guests often," she said one evening over the soup. "No." "How long has it been?" A pause. His spoon moved. 3 years. She did not ask why. She had the sense he would tell her if he wanted to, and that pressing would close the door she had not realized was slightly open. Instead she said, "The east wing is beautiful. The plasterwork on the ceiling of the long gallery is extraordinary. I hope you don't mind. I was exploring." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one quickly suppressed. "I don't mind." 2 weeks. She had begun to notice things she had not noticed at first, the way the house held its breath in certain rooms, the music room, which was closed, and the small parlor off the east corridor, which was always cold despite the fires lit everywhere else. The way the servants moved around the Duke with a kind of protective wariness, not afraid of him, but worried for him. The way one worried for someone who had been ill and was perhaps not entirely recovered. Mrs. Holt, who had thawed from efficient to something approaching maternal in the span of Eleanor's first week, mentioned once, carefully, that His Grace had lost his wife 3 years ago. She mentioned it in the way one mentioned something important that one hoped would be understood, without requiring further elaboration. Eleanor understood. She did not change her behavior toward him. She did not soften her voice or begin treating him with the careful delicacy that grief sometimes attracted. She simply continued to be herself, direct, occasionally sharp, quietly curious. And if he was sometimes startled by her directness, he had stopped showing it after the first week. He had stopped holding himself quite so carefully when she was in the room. The distance remained, but it had shifted slightly, the way furniture shifts when a house settles. One night, very late, she could not sleep and went to the library and found him already there. The fire had burned low. He was sitting in the dark with a glass of brandy and no book, simply sitting, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway and did not tell her to leave. She sat in the window seat. He sat by the fire. The clock on the mantel measured the silence in small, steady increments. "You don't have to stay," he said finally. He did not mean the library. She knew he did not mean the library. "I know," she said. "The roads are clear." "Yes." Another silence. The fire shifted, sending up a brief warmth of light. "I have nowhere particular to be," Eleanor said quietly. "And I am not unhappy here." She paused. "If that is relevant." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes in the firelight were very still. "It is relevant," he said, and looked back at the fire, and they sat in silence until the clock struck 2, and then she went to bed, and he remained, and neither of them said anything more about leaving. A month. The household had reorganized itself around her with the quiet efficiency of water finding its level. Her place at the dinner table had ceased to feel temporary. Mrs. Holt consulted her about menus and flower arrangements without being asked, and without any pretense that this was unusual. Thomas, the young footman, had begun saving the morning papers for her because she had once mentioned she liked to read them. The cook had learned she preferred her tea strong and had stopped asking. The Duke walked with her in the gardens on the afternoons when the weather permitted. The gardens were dormant in winter, the rose trellises bare and skeletal against the gray sky, the paths hard with frost, but they were beautiful in the way that bare things were sometimes beautiful. All structure and line, nothing hidden. They walked and talked, and sometimes they did not talk at all, and both were comfortable. She had learned things about him in the way you learned things about people, when you shared space with them over time, not through confession but through accumulation. He was methodical. He rose at 6 and rode before breakfast regardless of the cold. He was kind to his tenants in a specific practical way, not charitable in the grand gesture sense, but attentive, remembering names and circumstances, following up on things he had been told months ago. He had a dry humor that emerged rarely and without warning, and when it did, it was so unexpected that she always laughed before she had decided to. He had loved his wife. She could see it in the shape of the grief, not raw anymore, not the kind that bled when touched, but structural, worked into the bones of the house. He had not recovered from it in the sense of moving past it. He had simply learned to carry it, the way you learn to carry anything heavy, by adjusting your balance, by not putting it down. She did not know what she was to him. She did not examine it. She had learned over many years of living in spaces where she was not entirely wanted, not to examine things too closely. Examining things gave them edges. But she was aware, she had been aware for some time, that something had changed in the way he looked at her. Not dramatically, not in a way she could have pointed to and named, but his eyes found her when she entered a room, and they stayed. And there was something in the staying that was different from the assessing look of that first night, something that was not assessment at all. She did not examine it. The letter from her cousin in Bath arrived on a Tuesday in late February. Eleanor read it at the breakfast table, alone, before the Duke came down. Her cousin was very sorry. She was not in a position to offer accommodation at this time. She hoped Eleanor would find a suitable situation. She remained, sincerely, etc. Eleanor folded the letter and set it beside her teacup and looked out the window at the garden, where the first tentative suggestion of something, not quite green, not quite life, but the precursor to both, was beginning to appear along the south wall where the sun hit longest. Spring was coming. She had known it would. She had been not thinking about it for weeks, the way you did not think about a door at the end of a corridor when you were not ready to know what was behind it. Spring meant the roads would be clear without question. Spring meant the excuse of circumstance would dissolve. Spring meant that whatever this was, this arrangement that had never been named, this stay that had extended week by week without discussion, would require a decision that neither of them had made. She was still sitting there when the Duke came in. He stopped when he saw her face. Bad news? He asked. No. She picked up her teacup. Simply news. He sat down across from her. He did not pick up his newspaper. He looked at her with that still, intent quality that she had come to recognize as his version of attention, the way he looked when he was deciding something. Miss Ashworth. Your Grace, you have been here 6 weeks. Yes. I have not. He stopped, started again. I have not asked you about your plans. No, she agreed. You haven't. The silence stretched. Outside, a bird, the first she had heard in weeks, made a single tentative sound, and then stopped, as though it too was waiting. I should like to continue not asking, the Duke said. If you would. He stopped again. She had never heard him struggle with words before. He was always precise, always deliberate, and watching him be neither was doing something complicated to her chest. There is no reason for you to leave, he said finally. None that I can identify. And I find there are reasons I would prefer you to stay. Eleanor looked at him. He was looking back at her, and his eyes were very serious, and something in them was very exposed. The way things were exposed when you had been carrying them carefully for a long time and had finally set them down. What reasons? She asked quietly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you laugh at things that are actually funny. You read Latin for pleasure, and you don't apologize for it. You reorganized the linen cupboard without being asked, and then said nothing about it. He stopped. You're the first person in 3 years who has sat in a room with me without treating me as something fragile. Something cracked inside her chest. She had not expected that. She had been braced for something polite, something practical, some arrangement phrased in terms of household utility or social convenience. She had not been braced for truth. I didn't know you were fragile, she said. I'm not. A pause. Or I was, less so recently. Eleanor set down her teacup. She looked at the letter from her cousin, folded neatly beside it, and then she looked at the window, at the garden, where the first impossible green was pushing up along the south wall. I have nowhere to go, she said. That is, I want to be honest with you. I am not staying from preference alone. I have no particular destination. I know. I don't want you to think, Miss Ashworth. His voice was very quiet. I know, and I am telling you that I would like you to stay regardless, not because you have nowhere else to go, because I would like you here. He looked at her steadily. Those are different things. I think you know they are different things. She did know. She had spent years in a house where she was tolerated because removing her would have been inconvenient, and she knew precisely what that felt like, and this was not it. This was not it at all. Yes, she said, they are different. Then stay. The word was simple. It landed with the weight of everything that had accumulated in 6 weeks of shared libraries and winter walks and dinners, where the conversation ran past the candles burning low, all of it compressed into a single syllable. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. He had not looked away once. All right, Eleanor said. I'll stay. The spring came anyway, as it always did, indifferent to human arrangements. The roses along the south wall put out their first leaves. The paths in the garden grew soft with new growth. The world outside Ashfield Manor resumed its ordinary business, and Eleanor remained, and the household continued to treat her as permanent, because she was, and eventually, the arrangement acquired a name. He asked her in the garden on an afternoon in April, with the rose trellises finally beginning to fill in, and the sky the pale clear blue of early spring. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He simply stopped walking and turned to her and said, "I would like to marry you if you would have me," in the same voice he used for everything important. Quiet, direct, stripped of performance. She had been expecting it for 2 weeks. She had been not expecting it for 2 months before that. Yes, she said, because she had learned finally that some things did not require examination. Some things could simply be accepted, the way you accepted warmth after a very long cold, not cautiously, not with one eye on the door, but fully, with both hands open. He looked at her, and something in his face, the last of the careful distance, simply released. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for 3 years and had finally, quietly, let it go. He took her hand. They stood in the garden in the April light, and the roses continued their patient work around them. And it was enough. It was more than enough. They were married in June, at the small chapel on the estate grounds, with Mrs. Holt weeping with great dignity in the front pew, and Thomas, the footman, standing very straight in the back, and trying not to show that he was pleased with himself for having predicted this outcome since approximately the 3rd week of February. The vows were traditional, but when James took Eleanor's hands and looked at her, he added something that was not in any prayer book. Quiet, so that only she could hear. "One night," he said, "and then you stayed, and I never asked you to leave because I didn't want to know what the house would feel like without you in it." Eleanor looked up at him. Her eyes were bright. "I would have stayed anyway," she said. "Even if you'd asked me to go, I would have found a reason to come back." Something moved through his expression, something warm and wondering and wholly unguarded. "I know," he said. "I think I knew that by the 2nd week. Then why didn't you say something?" "Because you were sitting in my library reading Virgil in Latin, and you looked like you had finally found somewhere to put the weight down, and I could not bring myself to disturb it." She had no answer for that. She did not need one. 2 years later, on a morning in January, when the snow was falling softly outside the library window, Eleanor sat in the window seat. Her window seat, the one that had been hers since the 3rd morning when Mrs. Holt had shown her the library, and she had settled into it like a key into a lock, with a cup of tea growing cool beside her, and a small girl of 14 months asleep against her chest. James was at the writing desk, working through correspondence, and the fire was warm and the snow was quiet and the library smelled of old paper and beeswax and everything that had come to mean safety. "Tell me again," Eleanor said. He looked up from his letter. He always knew what she meant. "There was a storm," he said, "and a woman appeared at my door in the middle of it, soaking wet and trying very hard not to look desperate. And I let her in, because there was nothing else to do." He paused. "And then I didn't let her leave because there was nothing else I wanted to do." "One night," Eleanor said. "One night." He set down his pen. His eyes were very warm. "That became the rest of my life. The snow fell. The fire burned. Their daughter slept on, small and certain and entirely at home, and outside the window the rose trellises stood bare and patient under their white weight, already planning for spring." Thank you for staying all the way to the end of their story. Eleanor arrived with nothing but a soaked cloak and nowhere to go, and James offered one night out of obligation. And somewhere between the library and the winter walks and the dinners that ran past the candles, obligation became something neither of them had words for yet. If you believe in the kind of love that begins quietly and becomes permanent before anyone names it, subscribe and ring the bell. There are more stories here of impossible connections and the people brave enough to stop running from them. You are the reason these stories exist, and I am so glad you stayed.